chair the session. I think you, Renata, Professor Renata Bichir, who is our research coordinator, already told you about the dynamic of the session. We don't have presentations of the offers. It's just they cannot invent any last minute excuse for something, so it's just for the discussion. We go directly to the discussion. So it will be each of you, in the case of the two papers, the commentator, then the answers from the authors, then questions from the public, and answers and the discussion. If you want to enter again and discuss anything else or make other comments, you are more than welcome. And then we go on to the second article. Okay. We are going to start with Professor Marta Arretche and Daniel, and then we are going to have Jonathan and Nathan. Okay, is that right?
Okay, so good afternoon to all of you. Boa tarde. Just reinforcing Eduardo's words. We are very, very excited about having you here, both of you. Professor Daniel Béland is a professor at the Department of Political Science at the McGill University and author of How Ideas and Institutions Shape the Politics of Public Policy, published in 2019 by Cambridge University Press. And our second discussant is Professor Nathan Kelly from the University of Tennessee, Political Science Department as well, and author of America's Inequality Trap, published by the University of Chicago Press last year. So I think the protocol is clear, and we'll start with the comments, giving the floor to Professor Béland and his comments on Professor Arretche's paper and co-authors. Two of them are here today with us, Rogério Barbosa and Heloísa Fimiani. And it's titled, Which Popular Social Programs Are More Vulnerable to Retrenchment? A Study on Active Drift in Brazil. So up to 15 minutes, about 15 minutes, I would say. Thank you, Professor Daniel.
Hola, thank you very much for the invitation and for your introduction. I'm not a specialist of Brazil, as you know. Most of the stuff I've published on Brazil is with my friend Catarina Segato, who's here. I can see her. Hello, Catarina. But I'm interested in the theoretical issues discussed in the paper. And so if I'm allowed to share my screen, I prepared some slides. So I will go ahead here and put them up. All right. So this paper by Marta Arretche and colleagues is, I think, very timely. And I know people have read it in advance, or they were asked to read it, but I will still start with a very short summary in the own words of the authors, and then I will raise some issues. My goal here is to help the authors make this very good paper even better, to improve it ahead of maybe submission to a journal. I'm not sure if this is a journal article or it's part of an edited collection, edited book. I would be curious to know where they want to submit this later, but I think it has tremendous potential. It's already at a very good stage in terms of its development, but there are things that could be improved, as usual, is the case for all papers. And so I have some suggestions. But let's start with a short summary here. And so that's from the beginning of the paper. And so the paper focuses on Bolsa Familia and on the unemployment insurance program. And it compares the development of these programs in terms of retrenchment and policy drift with two other programs that were not retrenched, minimum wage contribution pensions and non-contributory pensions. I think what what is the most important point of the paper, theoretically speaking, and the cases are used, I think, quite neatly to make that point, is the importance of the distinction, what the authors call active drift versus passive drift. And there's a very large literature, a growing literature on policy drift that's related to the scholarship on retrenchment and permanent austerity that came out in the mid-1990s around the work of Paul Pearson's and his many followers. And then in 2004, Jacob Hacker coined, I think he coined or at least popularized the concept of policy drift in an article published in American Political Science Review. And later on, well, almost simultaneously, authors like Kathy Tellen and her collaborators helped promote that concept and theorize it. And I think that this is the very important contribution of the paper to really draw attention on some of the conceptual limitations of the concept of policy drift as it's used. I would say even that there is something of an ambiguity. The concept of policy drift is ambiguous. And in terms of when we relate it to the agency of actors and different patterns of political behavior. And I think that here, this distinction between active drift and passive drift, and the way it's really articulated and discussed through the case studies is really the main contribution of the paper. And so the claim is that the conditions for the emergence of passive and active drift are not the same. And so that's important. So beyond drawing a line between active and passive drift, which is a novelty in of itself, they try to also explain the conditions under which active drift is likely to emerge as a political strategy in a context that requires many veto points in the decision-making process, as well as the discretion of the executive branch to unilaterally adopt eligibility rules for social programs, end of quote. So I think it's a very neat argument. I like the theoretical distinction between active and passive drift, as I said, and I'm convinced by the argument about the conditions under which active drift can take place. In my critical comments, I will focus more on the theoretical issues raised by the paper rather than on the empirics. Again, because I'm not a specialist of Brazil, but I think overall it's a well-researched paper, but a paper that could be much more focused and coherent, because the authors engage in some side debates that might not be necessary. And I think that focusing even more on active drift, its meaning, and the conditions under which it emerges as a political strategy might be the way forward to improve the paper. So let's start a critical discussion. As I said, I really like the main argument and the novel distinction between active and passive drift. The main weakness of the paper right now, I think it's a rather diffuse writing. It could be much more focused and also more concise and to the point, especially as far as the theoretical sections, literature review are concerned. And I think what needs to be even clearer is what the takeaway message of the paper is. And also, I think the weakest part of the paper is really, and it often happens when it's a first draft or an early draft, is that the conclusion is really a big letdown. It's 1 page long, it's underdeveloped, and it as we say in French, on reste sur notre appétit. We're left on, wanting for more at the end in terms of what's the agenda for future research. What can we do with this distinction between active and passive drift beyond the 4 programs or issues discussed in the paper, and perhaps beyond the Brazilian case, depending on what the audience of the actual potential publication is. But I think this is a paper, because of its significant and explicit theoretical contribution, that many people who are not necessarily studying Brazil might find interesting. That's why I think the theoretical framing of the paper can be sharpened, and that the conclusion could be much bolder, and looking forward to reshaping the theoretical discussion about policy drift. Because again, the paper is very effective at setting a new agenda, but in the end, it doesn't really make this agenda as bold, as general, as compelling as it could be. So I think one thing that I find problematic in the, I find that the paper is a bit rambling sometimes and will benefit from copy editing to make it more concise and to the point. But I find that in the literature review, sometimes you drift, you drift aside from the main point and you take side fights over things that are not that central to your main argument and that are sometimes a bit problematic. And you don't want readers to start focusing on these side fights and forget about the main argument. So for example, and sometimes I'm not sure I agree with your side arguments. And one of them involves my work in part, so I will respond here. But on page 8, I think it's misleading. The statement is misleading regarding automatic indexation. The authors don't understand, I think, what indexation is, the strict sense of the term, or at least they don't really make it clear to the reader. Their empirical analysis suggests that automatic indexation, when it is truly automatic, that is, when you have automatic indexation, it means that you enact a legislation and then the program is automatically indexed and you don't need to renew that indexation process on a regular basis. This is something that is really on automatic pilot, on autopilot. And if you need to enact new legislation on a regular basis, then it's no longer really automatic. And so I think there is an issue here in the way the authors define automatic indexation. So I do think that automatic indexation, when it's truly automatic, does complicate retrenchment. It doesn't mean retrenchment is impossible. It's just more complicated. So I think this is a claim that could be either revised or, and it's just an example among quite a few of, again, side claims, side fights that the authors speak that are not so important for the main argument of the paper and may distract from it. Another issue here, as I mentioned, the conclusion, it seems that the authors really ran out of gas, right? So they wrote a very impressive paper with a very systematic literature review. They put forward strong arguments. They have, I think, good empirical sections, but as far as I can judge, but then it's like if the paper doesn't fulfill all its promises because it ends in a rather abrupt way without really looking at the future, at what, in a systematic way, at what people, including people outside of Brazil, could do with the distinction between active and passive drift. What are the maybe remaining theoretical issues that should be addressed in terms of understanding active and passive drift and policy drift more generally, and also how using other cases, maybe comparative cases, could also help to really fulfill the promise of this distinction between active and passive drift, and also really help the discussion about the factors that drive active and passive drift in terms of why do actors will pursue active drift as a strategy, for example, something that's discussed in the paper. How would this play out in other cases? I think, if some cuts will be enacted in other sections of the paper, including the literature review, which is again a bit long and with side fights, I think that the authors could write a proper conclusion or with an agenda for research. Also, I think the abstract will benefit from cuts. It's a very long abstract, and again, could focus more directly, more systematically on active and passive drift. And I think with these tweaks, which are not that major in nature, it's really about reframing, revising the writing more than the substance of the paper, because I think that the main argument about active and passive drift is right on target. And I think this paper has really tremendous potential. I'm just not sure what the authors want to do with it, what type of journal they are targeting. And that will be important too in terms of revisions. If they aim to publish this in, say, a Latin American studies journal, then maybe what I've said about the framing of the paper might not be as important if most readers have a substantive interest in Brazil. But if they want to submit to a comparative public policy or comparative politics journal where the readership is really global, then I think that they need to further emphasize the agenda for future research and what it means for people who are not necessarily interested in Brazil per se, but are interested in retrenchment, in the politics of permanent austerity, and especially in the concept of policy drift, which has really taken off in terms of the number of people who are using it. So it's a very important contribution, but right now I want a bit more in terms of the general overall agenda for future research, and I don't think it will take that much work for the authors to achieve this. So these are my I would have a few final remarks here. Because we're almost out of time. I'm almost out of time here for my 15 minutes. Again, avoid diversions, talking about issues or spending a lot of time on issues that are not really germane to the main argument of the paper. Be a bit more focused and develop not a stronger conclusion, not just with an agenda for future research, but maybe alternative explanations regarding your cases. I was reading your paper, for example, about social construction of target populations and whether that may explain some of the differences among the cases you're discussing. So some people, who might be skeptical about the concept of policy drift or about your own explanation about executive autonomy and veto points, they might point to the nature of the programs themselves. That goes back to a theme that you do discuss a bit in the paper, but you might need to engage a bit more with that literature in a systematic way. It's policy feedback, which relates to the social construction of target populations. There's an article by Schneider and Ingram in the special issue of Journal of the Policy Studies Journal. I co-edited in 2019, and they show the link between policy feedback and social construction of target populations. And I think the work of Schneider and Ingram here could be an interesting, they provide, I think, a potential interesting counter-argument or alternative explanation that you can then debunk or criticize to show the added value of your own contribution about active and passive drift. So again, because you talk about drift, it's a concept that relates to the one of policy feedback. It might be interesting to say more about policy feedback and perhaps even to discuss the social construction of target populations in your paper. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. It was very precise in terms of time. Before heading the floor to Professor Marta, Rogério, and Heloísa, just like to encourage people to participate through the chat. And you can also sign up for oral interventions afterwards. So, okay, Marta, the floor is yours.
Okay, just for how much time do we have, so I can leave some room for my co-authors? How much time do I have?
Total 20 minutes, right, Renata?
Total,
a little less.
A little
no,
okay.
Around 10.
Even though they are 3.
In,
yeah, okay.
Okay.
Yes, 10, 15.
So I'll try to be brief so as to leave some room to my co-authors. First of all, many thanks, Professor Béland, for having accepted to comment our paper and for your generous comments. I can let's say for myself that I'm very, very happy with your feedback. It's very encouraging, and although I understand we still have some work to do on it, so as to frame it according to your suggestions, which I very much thank, because I think they are very, very helpful. We would like to, and I agree with you that we could go more direct to the point, even to obtain more space to the conclusion. You are completely right. When we reached the conclusion, we had no more space and no more time. So we had to conclude on a very abrupt way, as you said. And thank for the clarification on the automatic indexation. It's very, very important because in Brazil, we have to look at, but I think all automatic indexations in Brazil are provisional, in the sense that we don't have, as far as I know, I should look at, but automatic indexation in Brazil is always for some time to be revised years ahead. And that's one of the reasons we understand that we, as an interpretation, we should give more attention to decision-making rules than to policy rules, because one of our arguments is that policy rules comprised automatic indexation can always be changed, whereas decision-making rules are more difficult to change because authors strategize around decision-making rules so as to have a good position to either to influence the policy rules. So we thought at submitting it at World Politics. We, as far as you know, is a journal that part of the discussion on policy drift, policy endogenous change, retrenchment has been published. So we have the impression that the community on policy retrenchment is somehow engaged in a debate through World Politics. So we thought it could be a good journal for us to submit it. That's why your suggestion of further developing and enhancing the conclusion so as to engage with a discussion with a broader community than that, let's say, making research on Latin America. So your suggestion turns out to be even more important as we consider to submit to world development. But if you have any suggestion, it will be very much welcome. So that's it. I very much accept your suggestion. I'm sure we will follow it very seriously. Follow them very seriously. So many thanks. But maybe Rogério and Heloísa would like to say a word.
Not really. I would just like to thank you, Daniel, very much. Your comments were very precise, and I'm sure it helps us giving structure to the text. I think it was very useful to help us frame the text better. That was the point the whole time. We spent a lot of time talking about it. It took us more than, I have never experienced that before. The framing was so difficult at the beginning. And then we came to this importance of active and passive drift and the distinction. And now we have a little bit more clear the way we have to go. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Daniel. I don't have anything else to add. I think Marta and Rogério summed up pretty much what I have, like the notes I have taken, and that's pretty much it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I bounce back just on something? I know that other people want to say things about the paper, and I see some comments in the chat, but about the world politics, one thing that I just noticed, I searched at least maybe my search function doesn't work, but you don't cite any articles from World Politics in your
Yeah,
current map.
sure.
And so that I think is not so I suppose you should look into this and add a few references. Someone who has published a lot in World Politics about institutional change, including Brazil, but has a very different perspective, is Kurt Wayland. There's an article in 2008 about a theory of institutional change published in World Politics. That's maybe interesting to look at it just because Kurt might be one of the reviewers. You never know. But I think it would be good to cite some recent papers in World Politics dealing with institutional change. If you sum it there, a good plan B, because World Politics has a very high rejection rate, as you know, will be comparative politics. And they publish, you know, they are really global. Comparative political studies may be a bit more quantitative overall, but I think comparative politics would be a good plan B. In terms of public policy, I would say governance might be very good too. They have published a lot about this issue. So governance will be probably a third choice after comparative politics and World Politics, but these are all very good journals. So good luck.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Nobody signed up for, may I add? Sure. And after Adrian.
I think Renata is also with her hand raised. Well, thanks a lot, Marta and colleagues, for the paper. It's really, really interesting and precise as usual. I have some localized comments in some places, but I can send you my notes afterwards, because sometimes I think you phrased or at least I understood wrongly, maybe in some passages it's active and you mention passive, and it's passive and you mention active. I'm going to send you this. But my main comment is the following. I'm reading the argument and following the Brazilian political scenario in the last years. I wonder if you don't have to separate a little bit a third actor in this story, which is Congress. Because there's a blame avoidance between the president or the government. The executive is obviously involved in a very strong blame avoidance process, and our president is the master of blame avoidance. This is the only thing that he does really well. But at the same time, he's always pushing the blame for Congress to do active drift on policies and retrench things, and Congress is dodging these strategies. And so I don't know if government and opposition is the best way of phrasing the Brazilian case. Maybe you have the opposition because the opposition is vocal, and if the president tries to cut and retrench something, they are going to do opposition. But at the same time, you have Congress, which is has a majority in favor of retrenchment or in favor of the reduction of policies, social policies in theory, in general, but will never put their digital, their fingerprint in the bill. So I don't know if you don't have to make this this whole narrative a little bit more complicated with the role of Congress. That's it. Thank you. But thanks. The article is great.
Adrian.
Thank you, Bianca. Well, first of all, congratulations for the paper. It's quite nice. I enjoyed a lot reading it. It puts forward a compelling conceptual distinction. I think actually the difference between active and passive drift it's a powerful one. And I'm convinced by the argument. I have an observation. I was wondering if part of the novelty of your argument, of the argument you are putting forward, rely on the classical distinction between old and new state welfare politics developed by Pearson. So by Pearson's argument, unlike old politics of expansion that moved forward by parties and unions, new politics of welfare is contingent upon how possible blame avoidance strategy is. So the dispersion of authority, as it allows for lack of accountability, it's a good condition for fostering retrenchment. So it seems that you are building around those lines, but I would say that more recent literature review, like that one of Green Pedersen and other ones, even Stark, has pointed out that the distinction, let's say the strong distinction or bold distinction between old welfare politics and new welfare politics is no longer consensual, and that actually all recent literature are using old variables and all explanations in a revised form for explaining the new welfare politics. So I was wondering if that doesn't change your main argument or the novelty of your argument, depending on how was the place or which was the place of centralization of authority in the old debates. So that's my question.
Would you please summarize your question, the last part of the old debate versus the recent debate?
Yes, if you are building around the lines that the old, for the recent debate, dispersion of authority, it's important because it makes possible to drift. And it's a kind of new different of politics, because the expansion was pushed forward through other variables, other factors. What I'm saying is that the more recent debates actually don't buy this strong distinction between old and new debate. They are working by revising the old variables and making more a new use or more, let's say, subtle use of the old variables, and so that should make you to maybe to change a bit the frame of the novelty of your argument, depending on how the role of the centralization of authority was in the old debates. Is not there in the new debates, but it might be there, and I'm not sure of it, in the old debates. So your argument may be not so novel. It depends on how you deal with that.
Anyone else?
Yes, I my hands. Marta, Rogério, Heloísa, I really enjoyed your paper. I think it's really, really interesting. And I totally agree with Daniel. But I was also wondering about the alternative explanations, okay, especially at the end. And I was thinking about the constitutional rights and non-constitutional rights. You raised this point in your paper, and this is a really good discussion. You know, when we look back at the beginning of the 2000s, there was this discussion regarding the Bolsa Família. Célia Lessa Tenesse has a really good paper on this. I can send you, claiming that Bolsa Família should be constitutionalized as a way to protect the program from retrenchment and this kind of austerity measures. So I think this is a big issue you should address, especially when you are comparing with the other case, because sometimes in the article, it's not so clear how you are comparing the four programs. Sometimes you are only talking about two, the main focus of the paper, but sometimes you are talking about the four cases. But the main line dividing BPC, pensões, and seguro-desemprego e Bolsa Família, it's this issue. And I also agree with Eduardo. looking at the way the executive deals with the Congress, it's really important. And during Lula and Dilma terms, there was a lot of people from MDS, from Ministry of Social Development, specialized on this, on vetoing measures, on blocking legislative measures regarding Bolsa Familia, you know. So the Congress was an important arena trying to protect the program. And they avoided this constitutionalized way because they were very confident that they could protect the program. So I think you should address this issue. I think this is a big deal. And there are minor comments that I put on the chat regarding Bolsa Familia, and I can send you later. But thank you. It's really, really nice.
But just for clarification, you were saying that an alternative explanation would be constitutionalization versus non-constitutional.
Okay. I'm sorry, for some reason I can't see the raised hands. So, but it's Jonathan now, right?
Hi, thanks, Bianca. So yeah, just to firstly extend one of Renata's points on the comparisons, I kept expecting to see a couple more cases at the end, right, for the BBC and the pensions cases, which didn't appear. And so there's no real comparison being made. These are two cases that you present are of the same phenomenon, active drift, right? And that's fine, but I think it's a little, the structure of the paper becomes a little confusing because you expect this sort of contrast between active and passive drift, but the cases you provide, the 4 cases are not even an example of that, if I understood correctly. The pensions are not a case of drift at all. Like they're just policies that worked and continue to provide good coverage and actually were expanded in the way that they should have been when there was a crisis, right? So there's no drift going on there as far as I understood and no retrenchment. If that's the case, then I think it would be useful to be clear about what role those policies play in the arguments, right? And I think they're theoretically really useful to show that this is, you know, the difference between active and passive. But it's not clear to me that the empirical cases are actually, the setup, the comparative setup is working for you in that respect. What you seem to be wanting to do is more say, you know, active drift in these 2 cases contrasted with no drift at all, right? Rather than active versus passive. And so I think setting up the paper to explain what comparison informs which theoretical innovation would be helpful. Another way to help with that, I think, is to be clearer about what you mean by drift and what the literature means by drift, because it's never really clearly defined in the paper. And I think a really explicit definition would help. And at least intuitively for me, drift means sort of stability in rules, right? The rules, the formal rules are just fixed. No one's playing with the rules at all. And this plays in a little bit to Daniel's point about the expiring indexation, for example, right? If we have that indexation expiring, then for me at least, there wouldn't be a potential for drift because, you know, there is no stability in rules simply by the design of the policy. And so I think, you know, defining drift will allow you to be more clear about the scope. And that's really important for programs like Bolsa Familia, because in your discussion, again, it wasn't clear to me if every year that this program is being implemented, what sort of the reversion point, what's the status quo assumptions that are built into the policy? Like if no one does anything, how many people get Bolsa Familia in 2022? Does the government have to set a new poverty line and coverage threshold every year, or do they roll over automatically? Those kind of things are crucial to understanding this as drift. And in some cases, it wasn't clear to me that that was happening. It sounded more like the government has to sort of make a choice every year. And they happen to go with the same number as last year, right? But that's not drift. That's just choosing the same number as last year, which is a kind of different thing. And so I think those distinctions are really important, both for definitional, conceptual purposes, but also for your points about blame avoidance, right? Because when you have that discretionarity, that obligation to sort of redefine the policy parameters every year, then there is more political responsibility placed on you as the executive. And so I think being clear exactly about how these decision-making rules work will help your argument. But I really enjoyed the paper, thanks.
Marta, Rogério, Heloísa, would you like to address the comments on the chat or answer the questions?
Yes, first of all, many thanks. Comments are also are very helpful as well. I'm trying to aggregate them so as to be fast. Well, let's say, yes, we have discussed a lot whether we should extend the discussion on the 4 papers, sorry, on the 4 programs. But again, it's a matter of space. So if you are successful in summarizing the conceptual and theoretical part, we can have more space to further develop the cases. But I think the conceptual issue Jonathan is raising is that it's not a comparison between active drift and passive drift, but instead a comparison between active drift and no change. So we have to reframe the paper so as to refine the discussion. So thanks a lot. We will have to think about that. And this will be very helpful to reframe the conceptual discussion and better adjust the conceptual discussion to the empirical one. So thanks a lot. As regard, I'm not sure, Renata, whether constitutionalization or not is an alternative explanation. Maybe it's part of the discussion. Not only because it's because constitutionalization takes out the authority from the executive power. So it puts the decision-making processes in the hands of the parliamentary arena. And so there is a different game, as Eduardo said, between not only between the president and Congress with an actor the president should look at when framing its strategy. And I agree with you that the opposition here is not between the governing coalition support and the opposition, because all parliamentaries tend to converge toward, let's say, a blame avoiding strategy of not imposing losses on the poor. So thanks. I think we should better clarify this point so as to have some words on the entire, let's say, on all relevant key actors of the game. Another important question is Adrian's one. If I correctly understood, you were saying that our argument is not so new, in the sense that the concentration of authority may play a crucial role either in the expansion period or in the retrenchment period. So we should somehow entail a further dialogue with the literature on the expansion period, in saying that the retrenchment period, unlike what Pearson said, the concentration of authority may play an important role. So is it that? Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. I hope my colleagues agree as well. But I think it's an important theoretical contribution we should add to the include when discussing, when reframing the paper. So thanks a lot. But maybe Rogério, I don't know if we still have time, but maybe Rogério and Heloísa would like, I guess I addressed all comments, and I thank again all of you for them. But maybe Rogério and Heloísa would like to say something as well.
I think you addressed everything. About this constitutionalization issue, we discussed about that a lot. We're trying to make it more general because this constitutionalization is a very Brazilian mechanism of making programs more harder to change, right? So maybe it could be framed as some kind of I don't know, more veto points or more arenas of decision. We involve more, it's harder to pass something when you have it in the constitution, right? So we were trying to make it framed this way in order to have some kind of comparative points to other countries. I'm not sure it works this way for every reader, but
Heloísa?
No comments as well.
Okay. There are
just to say that I just had time to look at the chat, so I'll copy and paste them because you know you can understand. I couldn't even look at it.
Very substantial comments actually.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a whole.
So I'll copy and paste them.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Anybody else? So we'll have a 5-minute break, and we'll come back and discuss with Professor Kelly and Jonathan's paper. So we'll be back at 2:50. Okay, see you. Professor Kelly, and he'll discuss Jonathan's paper titled How Do Local Income Inequalities Affect the Implementation of Public Services in Brazil? And okay, so Professor Kelly.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this discussion. It's been great so far. I really was delighted with reading Jonathan's paper. He made my job as a discussant a combination of easy and hard. Easy in the sense that it's a very well-written paper, hard in the sense that it's a very well-written paper. And so, you know, it's a little more challenging to come up with reasonable critiques, although I'll do my best on that front. I'll organize my comments by beginning with a quick summary of the paper and then highlighting what I think are some of the key theoretical and empirical contributions, and then dive into a sort of laundry list of questions, concerns, and comments that popped into my mind as I was reading the paper, and go that way. I did create a PowerPoint just to sort of record my thoughts, so if I can share my screen here quickly, I will do that. Okay. So a quick review of the paper. The core question, obviously, is really about how economic inequality affects the delivery of public services. There are a few outcomes of interest. The core ones are both the level and the quality of public education and healthcare provision. And importantly, the paper looks at how both the level and quality of public health and education provision vary by the income level of the neighborhood, looking at variation and how that occurs across neighborhoods. The context of analysis is subnational units in Brazil. While the context of the paper is Brazil, I think it's very clear that this paper has broad theoretical implications and that the results here could apply in other national contexts as well. I think the choice of Brazil makes a lot of sense. given the way that these public policies are allocated within Brazil, but I think it also would fit in really in any context where there's any kind of a federal structure. The paper uses a mix of methods, kind of triangulates by utilizing multi-level cross-sectional analysis, geographic regression discontinuity design, as well as an instrumental variables approach with time series variation. And the key findings of the paper are that higher economic inequality often increases the provision of highly visible education and health resources, but decreases the provision of less visible resources. And particularly in education, poorer neighborhoods get more quantity, but seemingly less quality of public service provision. I was happy as I was reading along through this paper that I saw some clear connections and linkages between some of the recent work that I've done. In my most recent book, America's Inequality Trap, I'm arguing that economic inequality in the United States is self-reinforcing, focusing on various electoral, attitudinal, and policy effects of inequality. And what I thought was really fascinating is that this paper actually provides a totally different mechanism for how rising inequality might sort of feed back on itself through the political system and become self-reinforcing by changing people's perceptions of public service provision, which I think is really cool and interesting. And then also Jana Morgan and I have a recent JOP article where we look at attitudes toward redistribution. And again, I thought that this paper provided a really nice explanation for why we might see declining support for redistribution across Latin America, and simply because if what we see in this paper happens in other contexts as well, the degradation of quality of public service provision really hits the poor hardest and might undermine their support for redistribution generally, and of course the rich are not really seeing losses from rising inequality, so that might lead to them naturally not changing their attitudes in the face of rising inequality. So I thought that the fun linkages between some of my recent work was really exciting. So I think this paper has a lot going for it. It's really polished at this point. There's probably a little bit of work to do left, and I think maybe some of my comments might help improve the paper in some smallish ways. But I think that the paper makes a lot of both theoretical and empirical contributions. On the theoretical front, I think the paper does a really nice job of reviewing several competing perspectives on the relationship between inequality, redistribution generally, and then applying some of those theories to service delivery more specifically. The paper focuses on sort of four competing potential theoretical explanations, and it does a nice job of explaining those and tying those to how what we might expect for a relationship between inequality and service delivery with variation across neighborhoods with different income levels. I also really appreciated that the paper doesn't even try to insist on a single theoretical winner. Really what this paper is doing is taking these four competing theories and specifying scope conditions for these four theories, suggesting that if we think carefully about when and how these four theories might apply, we actually find that they apply under different conditions. And by doing that, it leads to a much more nuanced understanding of what the relationship between inequality and public policy really is. The argument is really interesting and innovative and compelling, that different types of goods provision likely respond to inequality in different ways, in part driven by the capacity and motivation of citizens as well as policymakers with competing goals. So I think the theoretical setup of the paper is really useful, really interesting, and I think it's very well done. The empirical strategy is also innovative and interesting. The paper really conducts three complementary analyses of the same outcomes, but using very different approaches. I think that each of these three analyses probably wouldn't be convincing necessarily on their own, but when you put them all together, it's really quite powerful. I found it almost humorous that the paper really humbly refers to some of these results as preliminary, and maybe they are in some ways. But really, I see the analysis mostly in need of polishing rather than sort of serious wholesale revision. So overall, I think this is really an excellent piece of scholarship. I'm sure it's going to find a great home in print in the not too distant future. But I do have a few things to raise, some questions, concerns. Hopefully, they're helpful and constructive. So I'll just launch into those at this point. One of the things that I felt was a little bit missing from the paper is a discussion of what people actually want. The paper sort of takes the perspective of assuming interests of people with different income levels and coming from different areas. I wouldn't necessarily want to see a new analysis or anything added to the paper on this front, but some discussion of maybe existing work relevant to how people perceive and what they actually are demanding from government in terms of health and education provision would be helpful, I think, to provide some better context for the analysis that comes in the paper. A second thing that I wondered about was whether there is really such a clear distinction between verifiable and unverifiable goods. That's a very important distinction in the paper empirically and theoretically as well. And I wondered, really how much of a distinction there is between verifiable and unverifiable goods. It seemed to me, and I'll bring this up again in the empirical portion, it seemed like it wanted to draw a fairly bright line between these two types of goods, and I'm not so sure that there is such a bright line. I think there are differences, but it's not clear to me that there's exactly a dichotomy. Maybe I was reading too much into it to say that there's really a dichotomy there, but I think that a little bit more discussion could occur that could convince the reader that there really is this big difference between verifiable and unverifiable goods, and really how that works. And again, maybe focusing on some public opinion could help clarify that a bit. In large part, the theory is putting various pieces together into a sort of meta-theoretical framework that relies on specifying scope conditions for existing work. And I think it might be helpful to just really explicitly state that and maybe frame the theoretical setup a little bit more in that way. There are these four theories. There is a lot of competing evidence in the existing literature about which of these theories apply. What we really need to think about is when and where these theories apply. And that's what this paper is doing by specifying some specific scope conditions about when each theory applies, and then the analysis largely supports the theorizing. On the empirical front, one of the early things that happens in the paper is that there's a description of how algorithms are used to define neighborhoods, and these neighborhoods are defined primarily in order to make sure that they have economic homogeneity to the largest extent possible. The paper presents analyses using different algorithms, different cut points, different decision rules to define the neighborhoods, which I think is really helpful and useful. But I wondered about the logic of using algorithms to define the neighborhoods in the first place, because it struck me that we're talking about political decision-making and political processes, and neighborhoods in at least some cases are political entities that are defined sort of by a politician looking down. And if the neighborhoods that are defined by the algorithm don't match up very well with neighborhoods as people who live in those neighborhoods and politicians who are making allocational decisions think about that geography, then I wonder the extent to which that might create some slippage between the theory and the empirics. A small thing is that when the measure of income includes benefits, I believe, but I wonder if it would be possible to exclude benefits in a robustness check, simply because, especially on the lobbying power argument, it strikes me that it may be that benefits would have different power implications than market income might. So I wonder if that would change anything. I don't expect this would have a really big effect, but it might be something to consider. Another empirical point is that if allocation decisions are really being made across neighborhoods, like the theory implies, then I was wondering whether it might be useful to conduct some analysis at least where the neighborhood is the unit of analysis for inequality calculations. So as it stands now, the way I understand it is that we're looking at household level inequality within a municipality as the measure of inequality. I was wondering if you could look at inequality across neighborhoods. Obviously, the number of neighborhoods within each municipality is sometimes quite small, but if there could be some measure of inequality at the neighborhood cross-sectional level, then that could be potentially useful and interesting as well. Another measurement issue, in measuring service delivery, the paper makes a really strong effort and a useful effort, and for the most part successful effort, to focus on supply distinct from demand. But I was wondering as I read whether this can really, whether demand and supply in terms of service delivery can really be separated empirically, because it struck me that almost any outcome, and I especially thought about this on the healthcare service delivery side of things, might be affected by demand. So in particular, I mean, some neighborhoods, especially neighborhoods that are poor, may have very different sorts of health issues to deal with than more wealthy neighborhoods. And so it may be that, that there is a sort of demand component to what is supplied, and this could be a problem. And it may be that just some more explanation and description of what's really happening at the neighborhood level could be helpful here. But I wondered if this demand and supply sort of separation is really possible. And then coming back to that question of verifiable versus non-verifiable goods and services, it kind of highlighted for me the issue with this sort of dichotomy. For example, the UBS hours that the clinic is open are considered non-verifiable, which kind of surprised me, because I would suspect that this would be something that people could really pretty easily know. Now, I believe that it's true that for most of these things that people wouldn't necessarily pay attention until they actually needed the service. And then they would know about it. So it may be that it's not so much that, it may be that everything's verifiable and visible to people, but it's just that people don't pay attention, or only a very small subset of people pay attention to certain things because they don't need those services, and they only become aware of the lack of service once they need the service. So that might be a way to even more successfully describe this difference between verifiable and non-verifiable services. But I think it's something that's worth going into a little bit more. In terms of measuring non-verifiable education provision, I thought, the provision of, like, does a school exist was a classic example of verifiable provision of service. But the measure of the non-verifiable education service provision seemed a little weaker to me. I don't know the testing system in Brazil substantively at all, but I wondered the extent to whether the scores that were used really represent quality and not just the sort of underlying social conditions in which a school operates. I don't know whether these are kind of value-added scores where progress within student is tracked over time, or whether they're sort of school level scores or what, and maybe hearing a little bit more, especially if you're speaking to an audience that doesn't know the details of the Brazilian testing system, would be helpful. Probably a pretty minor point, I wondered whether a 4-level model was really necessary and how sensitive the multi-level model part of the analysis was to that choice. I know in my own work, I've found that multi-level models can be pretty sensitive to specification, both choosing the number of levels in the model, as well as the inclusion or exclusion of higher level control variables. So I wondered about that. Along those lines, I thought that in terms of the neighborhood level controls in the multi-level model, the population literacy seemed pretty minimal. I wondered about the possibility of accounting for racial composition. Political preferences would also seem pretty relevant in this context. So I wondered if we could beef up the neighborhood level controls. Again, I know that these models can be pretty sensitive to those kinds of specification choices, but I think some further justification of exactly what those neighborhood level controls are would be quite helpful. In terms of the structure of the analysis, I thought that the effort at triangulation was really helpful and beneficial, But I also thought that in terms of presentation, it might be more helpful to really dive in more detail to one of the approaches and then really just view the other two as supplements or sort of checks to bolster the ability to make causal statements. I mean, I thought that the multi-level model was the most straightforward in terms of, a standard person's ability to understand what's going on. I thought it might be helpful to dive into the details of that approach, really discuss the substantive effects, talk in much more detail about what the results mean for those models, and then just back those models up with the other approaches that maybe bolster the ability to make causal claims. And of the three approaches, I was probably most skeptical of the discontinuity portion of the analysis. So in the paper, there was a discussion of whether the exclusion restriction is appropriate, and brought up evidence that there's little difference in racial segregation on either side of the discontinuity, and pointing to the idea that there was sort of early adoption of the same formal institutions on either side of the geographic discontinuity. But I was surprised. I wasn't completely convinced. It struck me that there was a lot of potential for much deeper legacies of slavery that might enter in here. And I thought that this also sort of raised the sort of general point that the paper doesn't pay a great deal of attention to skin color and or race, and that could be something that could be probably nodded to a little bit more in this paper, but maybe is more of something that could be addressed in future research that goes beyond the analysis in this paper. But the discontinuity idea that the slavery legacy would have an effect on inequality, but it wouldn't have an effect on a whole lot of other social conditions that might go alongside it, seemed like a fairly heroic assumption. And so I think I would need to have more convincing on that point. Although if this part of the analysis were really sort of given a lesser place of importance compared to one of the others, if one of the others were elevated to like the main analysis and this were just a follow-on analysis, I think I would have zeroed in less on this. And so maybe that's another way to approach this. So in conclusion, I want to emphasize how strong I think this paper is. I really liked it a lot. I think it's very close to ready to go. I think that all of the things that I raised are kind of take them or leave them sorts of points, and are kind of eye of the beholder sorts of things. So I was really happy to read it, and I look forward to the discussion that we have as a group.
Thank you so much, Professor Kelly. Jonathan, you have up to 5 to 10 minutes.
Great. No, thank you so much, Nathan. That's phenomenal. Super helpful comments, and I appreciate the encouragement and endorsement. While I think the preliminary that's in the paper there is actually from when I presented this like 2 years ago at the same conference. So I can't really claim preliminary, not because it's more conclusive, but just because it's been there for so long. But thanks so much for the comments. They all make a lot of sense. I think they're all things that I was aware of as limitations, but you've given me some good ideas as to how to try and address those as well, which is super helpful. Very briefly on some of the more sort of standout comments, which I think I can do something about perhaps, is, in general, this issue of verifiability, I presented as a dichotomy, absolutely, and that's purely for sort of the simplicity of empirical testing, and because it's a new concept, it's hard to be respectful of its actual complexity, but it is a gradient. And I think what's complicated about things is that verifiability varies by person, and it varies by policy, and it varies by time frame, right? Like some of these things become visible and become understandable in the long term for people with enough resources and enough information to deal with them, and not for others. So it's really not a sort of service dimension level characteristic. It's a lot more complex than that. But we obviously don't have the data to test at that level of granularity. And so I'm simplifying hugely, and that creates a lot of problems. But I wonder actually if your suggestion is right, that I can actually arrange these more as a continuum and test them as that. So maybe I've been focusing on aggregating these into 2 distinct indices and actually treating them separately, even though it's a bit messier, might actually give me a bit more flexibility to relate the degree of verifiability to sort of a more gradual shift in the impact that they're having. That might be a fruitful way to proceed. Specifically, I knew this question of the UBS hours would come up because it's when revising the paper again, I saw it there, and I knew I put it there for a reason, and then I rethought the reason, and I think it doesn't make sense anymore. So my initial logic before I landed on this question of verifiability was much more about sort of there are these set of characteristics of service delivery which are, I guess, more fixed, more lumpy, more formal in terms of the number of equipments and things, right? The number of facilities that we have. And then there are these other issues which rely much more on informal effort and motivation amongst staff, for example. And actually the opening hours of public services vary hugely in practice, right? Like it's not that they necessarily open and close at the times they're supposed to. And so initially I had thought of this as something that's more of a quality issue, right? It more reflects the dedication and the motivation of the staff. And so I put it there as sort of an informal quality measure, thinking that I would be able to capture, you know, the realities that people actually experience on the ground. But then I realized that actually I'm taking this data from the government's official data set, right? Which obviously just captures the formal specific hours that they're supposed to open and not the reality. So I think even if there was a justification for it being a slightly more informal, quality-based rather than fixed, you know, formal mechanism, I'm not picking that up in my data. So that's clearly not helping me. And so I totally agree that I need to either take that out or switch it to the verifiable index. Regarding the neighborhood definition, I think this is a really interesting question, and it's not one I've actually spent enough time thinking about. To a great extent, the purpose of those neighborhoods was simply to understand variation by income level in the quality of services that people are getting. Where we aggregate to sort of other units where we have a much more complex mix, heterogeneous mix of incomes, it's then a lot harder to sort of understand which part of that unit is getting better services, right? But you're absolutely right that that's a mismatch with the reality of what people are, politicians at least, and bureaucrats are working with. And so I'll have to think more if there's an alternative specification. I'm not sure. It would be a good question for others to chip in on if they have any thoughts. What is the sub-municipal unit that bureaucrats and politicians think about? Obviously, in Sao Paulo, we have much more complex hierarchies, but in rural municipalities and smaller municipalities, I'm not sure if there is such a clear structure. So I'd be interested to hear your suggestions on that. The rest of the comments, I think. Yeah, I agree on some of the methodological issues around the multi-level model, about the discontinuity, absolutely. There's this sort of trade-off between wanting to have a more central specification and then complement it versus then, you know, needing to explain in more detail those complementary methods to make them at all supportive of the conclusions. But I think you're absolutely right that there needs to be more focused in the analysis. Otherwise, I think I'll totally just accept every comment because I think it helps me a lot to think about the revisions that are needed. And I'd love to hear any other comments that people have. But thank you so much again, Nathan, for the comments. This is fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. We'll have here Brody, then Vera, Ursula, and Edu. So Brody.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm on my iPad today, so I wasn't sure. I wanted to start just by saying thank you for this paper. I found it really fascinating as somebody who's interested in these issues, but from a completely different perspective. It was a great read, and I really enjoyed it. I had a couple of questions, two of which actually overlap, I think, with some of the comments, which is interesting given that disciplinarily we're coming at it from very different angles. And then one is very specifically the comment of someone who's a historian reading this. So take that for what it's worth. But to start, I had a similar question about the definition of neighborhoods. And I think the point about the political definition of neighborhoods is really important. But I was coming at it actually more from the perspective of whether or not the neighborhood that you're defining by income is the same as the neighborhood within which people claim services, right? And that is also something that maybe is not being captured here, although I'm not enough of an expert on these methods to know. But when I was reading, it really struck me that that could be a dissonance that maybe could use some explanation. The second question that I had, it was also similar to a question that was already asked, which is that I think that there's an assumption sometimes, which I can understand, this is such a complex sort of array of methods and data that you have to simplify. But the question of whether low quality is completely to be blamed on the processes that you are highlighting in the paper, or whether there's also something that has to do with the ability of different populations, different neighborhoods, different groups of people to actually make demands for quality at the sort of basic grassroots level, that is, and factors that have to do with people's use of the resources that might impact something like test scores in a way that politicians actually don't have a lot of control over. And so I was wondering sort of how you thought about that issue of, you know, how it is that who the users are can actually make a difference in terms of what they're asking for and whether or not they're able to use the resources in the way that the resources are meant to be used. I was thinking about this especially because in Chicago, there's been a huge push with our COVID vaccinations to try to locate vaccination sites in low-income neighborhoods. And what's been really interesting is that they're having a terrible time actually getting people to show up for those appointments who are from those neighborhoods themselves. And so it's not the policy, it's something to do with the mistrust of the healthcare system, with the, you know, with the lack of integration of the policy with the people. So that was a question that was raised. And then the last one, and this is the one where I'm just going to put on my hat as a historian. When I read the Fujiwara paper, which I happen to know, I think that I'm with almost every historian in that it makes me want to tear my hair out as a way of explaining difference over time, because this line is coterminous with so many other things that are better explanations for inequality than the line itself, that using it as a causal factor is just bizarre. And his treatment of slavery, when he describes the geography of slavery, he says it's most important in Central America, and then he says Cuba is in Central America. I mean, there's so many things in that paper that are just, you know, really off base for somebody that knows the history. And particularly if this is being used in the context of Brazil, the fact that the line coincides with density of settlement is just such an obvious problem to using it as a kind of causal factor, right? Because if you're looking at where were the places within the Brazilian geography that were economically important over time, they're all on one side of the line. And so it's not very surprising that you have more slavery there, but it also means that you have all kinds of other historical processes that are being set off, having to do with land distribution, having to do with the structuring of economic activity and forced labor. I mean, there's just so many things, you know, that are there. And then in addition, you know, what a historian, and I worked with James Mahoney for many years, and so I had this discussion directly with him, but the idea of sort of using a remote historical point and then jumping to the present tense without sort of paying attention to what's in between, you know, for a historian that just doesn't make any sense. So I don't know whether you care, you know, as somebody, where you're going to publish, whether any of this matters, because there are definitely disciplinary divisions, and it's not like you're going to have a lot of historians reading this and criticizing you for it. So in that way, it may not matter. But I think that intellectually, I'm just not sure kind of what this seemed to me like the part of the paper anyway that was the most dispensable. And I just wasn't quite sure, you know, whether what it was bringing to the paper was worth all of the problems that aren't your problems. They're problems with the article that you're drawing from, I think. And so, you know, I guess I just wanted to raise that and let you know how somebody reads that part of it when they're coming from another field.
Thank you, Brody. Vera?
Hello, can you hear me well today? Okay, so thanks a lot, Jonathan, Kelly, and Brodwin. Really very good paper, very good comments. And as Jonathan said, congratulations, Jonathan. It made a huge difference from 2 or 3 years ago when you started to present the first version of the paper. I have some few comments. The first one, maybe Kelly also spoke a little bit about it, But when you speak about the visible and the not visible outcomes you are looking, they are quite the same when you speak about health and education, but they are quite different when you speak about the non-visible ones. You know? Because when you're speaking about the visible, it's about supply, but the not visible, when you go for education, you go for outcomes. You know? And my first reaction was, well, you should go for outcomes also in the health sector. You know, you can do it. But when I think about this, I say, well, but how are you going really to identify what is being related to social conditions and what are really outcomes of the services you are implementing? You know, something that Kelly spoke about. You know, he's in doubt about your measures on education. You know. So I think here you still have a problem. not sure about how to move forward with that. A lot is speaking about inequality and differences in health indicators. So if you go for outcomes, you always have this problem, but maybe you should face the problem. You know? A second point is about, you speak about the political mechanism, you know, vote, coordination, lobbying. But as Broden already said, you don't speak about mobilization. Mobilization, sometimes you speak, but then you stop speaking, but you don't put in a hypothesis further. And you don't speak nothing about social participation. You know? All these are difficult to measure, but as you are working with them, you are making hypotheses and seeing what should be the behavior. You know? So you could work with this, making hypotheses and see if you can find something related to this two specifications. But you also could work more in some empirical cases to see if the mechanisms that you are describing and your theory is pointing at plausible explanation, if they really, in fact, you can find this in
Vera, it's muted. We can't hear you.
The third point, yeah, now you hear me again? Yeah, it was.
Vera, I think you
Okay,
should
the third
close
point
your
is
camera.
it's not a political.
Your connection is not good.
Okay.
If you stop your.
Try to, yes.
Okay, that's it. It's better now? Yeah. So the third mechanism is not a political one, but maybe you should think about it, is the problem of professors and physicians really need to be there. You know? And this is not a political decision always. You know, people, this is something that everyone knows. Physicians and professors sometimes don't want to live in poor and violent peripheries. And this is very important for quality in services. You know? Maybe with the pandemic, part of this problem will be solved. Let's see, but it's a huge problem, you know? And I don't know if you can just don't speak about it if you are speaking about quality. You know? Well, you say that there are very little works looking at quality, you know, public implementation of public policies and quality. I don't think. I think there are a lot of evaluation of public programs, but they don't really look at what you are looking, how the quality is affected by inequality. You know, but maybe you could recover some of this work and try to make the links. You know. I'm finishing your figure 5. I think that if you use different visible and not visible outcomes for health, you probably would have a different proportion in the figure when you. And I would like to see a bit more description about the profile of the unequal municipalities, you know, in the paper. So you don't present more about the population, the values, a little more of their profile, okay? Because more or less medium to big cities and how this make a difference. So thanks very much, Jonathan. Really appreciated the paper, and I think it's quite ready. Not very much, but in terms of future research, you still have things to do. Oh, I still with the video. Sorry.
Edu, I think it's the last. Nobody else.
I think Ursula is also.
Yes, I'll try to be
raise hand.
I just
very quick. It's okay. It's okay. So hi everybody.
No, it's me actually. Sorry.
It's you? Sorry.
No, Bianca.
I thought it was me, but it's okay.
Yeah, it's Ursula and then Edu.
Oh, okay. Okay, sorry.
Okay. Hi everybody. Hi Jonathan. Congratulations. I think the paper is great, very strong. You changed many things, improved many things. Some minor comments and some doubts I have. The first one is about the neighborhood. The same Brodin has already posted to you. I'd like to know if you're looking at the same people about income and service. I think this matters a lot. The second one is, I know you're considering that as a hypothesis in the model, but who are these people, and rich and poor people, if they are using or not the service. But I think you should put some comment that in Brazil, in most part of municipalities, big municipalities, metropolis, rich people go to private schools and go to private health. So for them, tax benefits are more important than public service. And this can make some difference. We talked about that. I don't know if I'm saying that you have to put this in the model, but I think you have to comment about that most rich people are worried about tax benefits, and these tax benefits depends on the federal government, and the public service about the school and UBS and health service depends on local government. So it's quite different, the pressure they can make. And another part of the text, the third point, is that you comment that rich people try to avoid property tax, the local tax. But in most municipalities in Brazil, this is very low. So education policies and health policies depend much more on consumption taxes and on federal transfers. So you can't make this direct pressure about taxes and the offer or the supply of the service. It's a bit more complicated. So I don't know how to put this, if it's matter a lot, but I think it would be interesting to you to comment that it's quite different from the US, for example, where property tax really matters for local governments to offer service. It's only that. Thank you, and congratulations about your paper.
Thank you, Ursula. Edu?
Sorry if I intruded before, but the host doesn't have a hand in this program, in this platform. So I have to understand my position. I don't know why. Well, two comments. Very, very good article again, Jonathan, but I have two comments. One of them is the same, actually, or very similar to the first one. But a comment I did in the first version 2 years ago or 1.5 years ago, but which has to do with what follows Brodwin's last point about the Tordesilhas line. The problem is, I think there are two problems in this article, in this argument. The first one is that it's really it doesn't seem very good to bring something which is so far away without showing the connections that make something that happened 500 years ago still affect the distribution of inequality today. But the main problem is not this, because there are pieces showing the importance of the Roman structure of roads and the Adrian Wall in England and the association between this and the roads today. But the thing is, the Adrian Wall existed. The Tordesillas Treaty was a failure. It never produced any really, it was never enforced. From the first moment the Portuguese were cheating the treaty, and there was no police to make them accept the treaty. So I think, as Brodwin said, actually, when you see the map, you see the map of the southeast and the northeast of Brazil, the original first moments of occupation that didn't have to do with the treaty itself, had to do with the amount of people and resources that the Portuguese crown could put in the new continent to extract resources. And since these places were very rich in resources, not only by the coast to agriculture and things like that, but also enslaving Indians and gold and mines and everything, they didn't go very far because they didn't need to go very far. So I think if you try something like a band of 300 kilometers from the coast or 400 kilometers for the coast, it would be the effect, the numeric methodological effect would be similar, and you would have something which is more acceptable for the reader who knows Brazilian history. So this is my first point. And the second point is a kind of alternative explanation that I thought when I reread the article now, which has to do with quantity and quality. There's an alternative explanation that could say that or state that quality needs the services already built. So quality is something that can appear as a problem if the services are there. So in poor places, you have to have a service before, and since previously you didn't have the services in poor neighborhoods, it's really difficult for them to have quantity and quality. So some kind of exploration of time of the equipment, data of the inauguration of the UBS or something like that, or the school, could try to test or get rid of this alternative explanation. Thank you.
Thank you all. Jonathan, you want to address the comments and questions? It's just that we were.
Bianca, you have actually.
Can you hear me now? No.
Yes.
No, I was just saying that we were supposed to end at 3:30. So you're already, and it's already 3:40. But please, Jonathan, you may answer and address whatever you feel like.
Yeah, I wish I could. So these are fantastic comments, everybody. Thank you so much. And I know some of them are a little repetitive, and so I apologize if I haven't adequately addressed your concerns from previous presentations. But I think it's partly related to a disciplinary thing, as Brodwin said. The political economy sort of demands are very different from history and from urban studies and things like this, but that doesn't diminish the importance of these comments and addressing them. So I will definitely go back and try harder. And I think there's some really important suggestions and things here. In like 30 seconds, just to highlight, so some of your concerns I think are captured in the actual measures I'm using already. So for example, on the neighborhoods definition, the point of these measures is to capture exactly the accessibility to these services. So if in a neighborhood that does not exist a clinic, for example, then that is captured in the measure. That people have to go and travel to a separate neighborhood to access those services is captured. And I think that's an important element to to measure. Similarly, Du's point about the quality, if there's no UBS in your area, then the quality measure that you are attributed is from the nearest clinic that may be outside of your neighborhood, right? And so we're trying to sort of separate these questions of quantity and quality and not confuse them. And I don't know if that necessarily addresses the point, but I totally agree that, you know, you can't have quality unless you have quantity. And there may be some complex interaction of these things going on. But the effort here is to try and separate them and say, you know, if you did have to travel, if you did have to go to somewhere else, what would the quality be that you would experience, independent of whether it's accessible to you? Yeah, in terms of the lineage of Tordesillas, I'm aware of all of these concerns and I agree with them. I do think that one needs to try and search for some complementary sources of evidence to support my claims beyond the descriptive patterns that we see. And I think there are very few sources of controlled variation in inequality. And while I understand the historical concerns and those need to still be addressed, there is a remarkable present day pattern of inequality along that line. And so I think that is something that I need to describe and explain better, and I may choose to drop it if it's not helpful. And obviously there's a reason that I haven't emphasized this more up until now. But I do think that some of these concerns can be addressed, and others of them, you know, I may just have to live with. Vera, just on the theory again, I think the question about mobilization and about social participation, again, is something that I did try and incorporate into the definition. So whether it's, you know, I think there are different types of mobilization. So whether it's the median voter around election time, whether it's, you know, lobbying by small groups of individuals, usually people with more resources, those are reflected in a couple of the theories. There may be additional mechanisms which I should consider. So I'd be interested to hear if you have more specific suggestions. But again, those in theory are captured. There are too many other comments here, I think, for me to address quickly, but I will go through them in more detail. And just to thank you again for everything. Thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you all. Can you hear me? Looks like it's frozen. Okay. I don't know if Eduardo wants to make any final comments, or should we just wrap it up?
Yeah, I think just thank you all for the participation, especially the presenters. First the presenters, Marta and colleagues and Jonathan, then the commentators and everybody. It was, again, a very good discussion and a very rich seminar. And we see each other next week. And our session next week will start at 1:30 Brazilian time. Is that right?
Yes, 1:30.
1:30 Brazilian time,
Yes.
which is different from today. So probably we'll send a reminder to everybody on Monday, because people tend to adjust to habits and very fast. So so that no one loses the session, we'll start on Wednesday at 1:30. Thanks a lot for everybody.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.
And thank you, Bianca, for the coordination of the session also.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. See you. Bye.